I mean, complete demolition by 12 o'clock. And it'll happen over a period of 4 hours if we wanted to. We don't want that to happen. We may even get involved with helping them rebuild their nation. And you know what? If that's the case, the last thing we want to do is start with power plants, which are among the most expensive things, and bridges.
So we start here at 6 tonight with breaking news. President Trump backing off his threats to launch a large-scale attack against Iran, citing progress in negotiations.
Clarice, President Trump called this a double-sided ceasefire, and both sides will stop military actions. Iran accepted the 2-week ceasefire and said it would begin negotiations with the United States in Pakistan on Friday.
Trump promised dominance. Instead, he paused the bombing, called Iran's proposal workable, and watched Hormuz stay tied to Iranian leverage. That is not how empire writes victory. Empires always think the story ends the same way. They believe size is destiny. They believe force is enough. They believe that once they strike, the smaller power will break, kneel, and accept the terms written by the empire. That is the mythology of Goliath. And every empire that believes it too deeply eventually walks onto the battlefield wearing its own arrogance like armor. Then one day the stone lands. That is what this moment looks like. The United States and Israel launched this war on Iran, expecting coercion to produce submission. Bomb first. Escalate pressure. Threaten annihilation. Then force Tehran to negotiate from weakness. But the newest developments suggest something far more humiliating for Washington. Reuters reports that Iran rejected earlier U.S. proposals, including a 15-point plan it viewed as excessive. Then, after weeks of pressure, Trump agreed to a 2-week suspension of bombing and publicly described Iran's 10-point proposal as a workable basis for continued negotiations. That is not full American dictation. That is the side that launched the war stepping toward the framework proposed by the side it tried to break. That is the first stone. And the second stone is Hormuz. Because this is where the image of imperial control begins to fall apart in public. Trump made reopening the Strait of Hormuz central to the ceasefire. But Reuters reports Iran's position is not a simple unconditional reopening. Iran's ambassador said passage would remain subject to Iranian military coordination and stricter rules during the truce. Reuters also reports that the future legal status of the strait remains unresolved, meaning the ceasefire did not restore the old idea of free, uncontested movement on purely American terms. Think about what that means. The empire that entered the war promising dominance is now dealing with a ceasefire architecture in which the adversary it sought to discipline still has enough leverage to shape traffic through one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. That is not what victory theater was supposed to look like. Now, let's slow this down. This does not mean Iran won some total, final, clean victory. And it does not mean Washington accepted every Iranian demand exactly as written. That would be dishonest. But it does mean something deeper and more revealing. It means force did not produce the kind of political submission Washington advertised. If this war had gone according to the script, Trump would be announcing surrender terms. He would not be calling the other side's negotiating paper workable. He would not be pausing strikes. He would not be moving from ultimatums to suspension. And that is the lesson empire hates most. Military superiority is not the same as strategic control. You can dominate skies, drop bombs, and still fail to dictate the political ending. You can devastate and still not rule the meaning of what comes after. You can look like Goliath and still walk off the field ridiculed because the smaller side proved it could survive, absorb, and bargain. That is what Iran has done here. Not by defeating the United States symmetrically, not by overpowering it, but by surviving long enough, imposing enough cost, holding enough leverage, and keeping enough political coherence to prevent America from writing the ending alone. And that matters because this war was never just military. It was economic. It was diplomatic. It was psychological. Hormuz sits at the center of global oil and LNG transit. Reuters reports the ceasefire came after severe disruption to global energy supplies, and shipping companies are still seeking clarity because normal passage has not simply snapped back to pre-war conditions. Major lines remain cautious, and Iran has warned that unauthorized transit could still be targeted. In plain language, the battlefield may have paused, but the leverage remains alive. That is the third stone. Because it means the war revealed something else too. America can still strike hard, but it cannot always restore order on command. And when an empire can start the fire but cannot easily control the consequences, that empire begins to look less like an all-powerful architect and more like a dangerous giant stumbling over its own momentum. This is where the Goliath metaphor becomes precise. Goliath is not ridiculous because he is weak. He is ridiculous because he is too convinced of his strength. He mistakes size for invulnerability. He mistakes power for inevitability. He mistakes the smaller opponent for already defeated. That is what great powers do right before they expose themselves. And that is what this US-Israeli war on Iran has started to expose. Washington believed escalation would force compliance. Instead, it ran into resilience. It believed bombing would settle the political question. Instead, it found itself back in negotiations. It believed Hormuz could be reopened through pressure. Instead, it now faces a ceasefire in which Iran still insists on shaping how passage works. Now, let's find out China's role in this ceasefire agreement. Reuters reports Trump says he believes China helped persuade Iran to negotiate, while Beijing welcomed the ceasefire and repeated its support for diplomacy. That does not prove China wrote Iran's 10-point proposal, but it does suggest something strategically important. Even in a war started by Washington and Tel Aviv, Beijing may still be able to influence the diplomatic space that follows. That is not a small detail in a world moving toward multipolarity. And that should worry Washington for a reason beyond Iran itself. Because every time America reaches for war and ends up needing diplomatic exits shaped by others, its image changes. It stops looking like the unquestioned writer of global outcomes. It starts looking like a superpower that can shatter things but not always govern what comes next. That is how imperial prestige erodes. Not only in defeat, but in overreach. Not only in losing battles, but in winning firepower and losing narrative control. Not only in being challenged by equals, but in being embarrassed by those it thought were too small to matter. That is what David and Goliath is really about. Not smallness defeating size by magic, but overconfidence walking directly into its own humiliation. And that is why this moment matters beyond the ceasefire itself. Because if Iran can reject Washington's maximal terms, survive the assault, and still force the world's most powerful state to work around its leverage at Hormuz, then the message travels far beyond the Gulf. It travels to every state watching the empire. It says the giant is dangerous, but the giant is not limitless. It says the empire can still destroy, but it cannot automatically dictate. It says power without strategic humility eventually invites ridicule. And history is full of empires that became most vulnerable precisely when they seemed most certain of themselves. So what does the resolution of this moment tell us? It tells us that the war on Iran did not end in the clean imperial way Washington wanted. It tells us that Tehran was battered, but not politically erased. It tells us that Hormuz became not a conquered outcome, but a negotiated pressure point. And it tells us that the empire that arrived promising control may now have to live with the image of having paused, adjusted, and moved toward the terms of the enemy it swore it would subdue. That is not full surrender. But it is ridicule enough. Enough to expose the myth. Enough to puncture the theater. Enough to remind the world that great powers like Goliath often fail not because they lack strength, but because they mismeasure it. They believe it is absolute. They believe it exempts them from consequence. They believe no David can ever force them into discomfort. And then the stone lands. Empire always tells you it is invincible right before reality teaches it proportion. This is Liberation Lens, where we strip away the spectacle, confront hypocrisy, and expose the power behind the headlines. If this analysis hit something real for you, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share this video widely. Because silence protects power, and truth only moves when people choose to carry it. Stay alert. Stay critical. Perspective matters.